Chapter 5. Rumored. The Bog sailed 2 more months since their stopover in the Orkney Islands, making their annual and final stop at Burke and leaving just enough time to complete winter preparations in their home village. Only 4 ships moored in Hooligan Harbour, packed with enough goods to yield a fruitful trade. The rest returned home. As per custom, big boobied Bertha was the first to step off the ship, square-shouldered and round-bottomed. The usual choice crowd stood on the dock to greet her.
"Ah, stoic. I see I haven't changed a bit, except that pouch you're carrying around in your middle there,"
Bertha greeted, following up with a booming laugh. "Bertha," Stoic replied gruffly. They gripped each other's forearm with strength to test the durability of their bones. Bertha observed the few men behind Stoic, recognizing the usual pack, save one.
"Where's your boy? I got Kami round here somewhere. Oi, Kamikaze, get out here. Throw her above. I can't keep her in my sight for a mo—"
Bertha trailed off when she noticed the grim expression sent her way. She drew the most obvious conclusion.
"He's not. Was he?"
In all honesty, it was a miracle the boy survived for as long as he had with the frequent dragon raids. Many of the outside tribes had been waiting for word when Stoic's boy would finally meet his end. A tense silence passed, and then, "Outlawed." It came from the party of hooligans standing behind Stoic and sounded more like a cough. Bertha's eyebrows rose. Outlaw could be considered a fate worse than death by most, even lesser outlaw, especially for someone of Hiccup's stature. At least if Hiccup died in battle, it could be considered an honorable death. There was no honor left when someone died in exile.
"Banished, huh? Can't say I'm surprised,"
Bertha commented without much sympathy.
"Always thought something was funny about that boy. Just wasn't right."
At least her undersized child could hold her own, for which she thanked Odin every day. The men flanking Stoic's side each looked alarmed at the statement. It was an unspoken taboo to mention Stoic's former son. But Stoic showed no signs of rage or discomfort. He didn't show much of any emotion. He was, for lack of a better word, stoic. No one could see how desperately Stoic wished that Gobba wasn't tied up with the shop after the loss of his apprentice. He could have used his best friend by his side, as he undoubtedly would be expected to recount his most painful memory to their company. Kamikaze popped out from behind her mother's wide set hips. None of the adults had noticed her presence beforehand.
"Hiccup's gone?"
she gasped.
"Aye, he left,"
Stoic said with an even voice. "Betrayed us for the dragons."
He...
For once, Kamikaze didn't know what to say. She had just seen him not 2 months ago. Sure, he had been acting a bit weird, and she thought it a little suspect that he had been on his own. But not once did he let on that he was outlawed of all things. The girl struggled to find the right words, her confusion bared across her features, staring between the towering adults as though they were responsible for Hiccup's absence.
"Ah, you liked him, didn't you, lass?"
Bertha said, sounding as though she were trying to be considerate.
"You'll be better off without him in the end."
Kamikaze scowled at her mother. A muscle in Stoic's jaw twitched, but otherwise he kept his composure. The bog burglars were well-traversed gossipers, and by this time next year, all the lands should know of the Viking boy who sided with the dragons. Dealing with the open gossip about his son in the first few days after his exile had been hard, and Stoic eventually silenced the talk with angry stares and threats, thinking it would make his transition into a childless life easier. But the whispers that followed had been even harder to bear. No one would say anything outright anymore, but the allegations only seemed to grow worse. First there was talk of Hiccup being cursed by Loki, that the gods chose a scapegoat to punish the village for some past trespasses. Then came the talk of a spy planted by the dragons, that Hiccup's weak mind had been overpowered by magic, that he'd been passing the secrets on to the beasts. And finally, the worst. Talk of Valka being unfaithful on one of her voyages. After all, how could someone like Hiccup the Useless be of Stoic's brood? The woman had clearly lain with someone of a lesser status, a Saxon or a Roman, perhaps. No one seemed willing to put any of the blame on Stoic. The entire village loved their chief, preferring to lay blame on the other half of Hiccup's blood, and it took all of Stoic's self-control not to unleash his fury on the next unsuspecting citizen who looked at him with pity. Surely the theories would reach the bog burglars, and within 2 seasons his wife's good name would be tarnished across the barbaric archipelago. Anger bubbled beneath the braided beard and the spiked armor. Deep within his breast churned a hate Stoic fought daily to keep at bay. Hatred for the dragons, hatred for the village, and hatred for his son. His former son. That hatred felt like a double-headed spear, half stuck in his own gut. Stoic's burbling wrath was put to a halt when the tiny black-clad blonde whirled on the spot, her long hair flying behind her, and marched back up the plank with purpose.
"I'm going back to the ship,"
she announced loudly. The girl may not have her mother's figure, but she certainly inherited the boisterous woman's voice.
"Kamikaze!" Bertha snapped. "That is no way to behave towards the hosts." "I don't care. This is going to be so lame without Hiccup."
She left the group of Vikings to stare after her. "Kids, getting so uppity these days," Spitelout muttered. "Never acted like that in my day." Kamikaze said those words to cut the adults. She couldn't stand the way her mother spoke of Hiccup's absence as though it were a blessing in disguise. She imagined how true they'd prove to be. The trade with Burke wasn't the same without Hiccup. Sure, Kamikaze could get along with the other kids around her age, and by get along she meant besting them in bladed battles, but beating everyone got old after a while, and there were only so many opponents one could find in an island, and she missed the dry humor and witty banter the chief's son would provide. She could think of crazy schemes, but Hiccup would always think of crazier. Like his latest scheme, the craziest of them all, and he hadn't even let her in on it. It didn't take long for the bog burglars to find out the details behind the hair of Burke's outlawry. Because it was so taboo, everyone was willing to whisper about it behind closed doors. When Kamikaze first found out Hiccup had sided with the dragons, riding off on the back of a night fury, she had been furious. He had his moment to tell her. It was just the two of them on the island, right before her mother came calling. And he said nothing. They weren't the best of friends in their limited time together, but they shared camaraderie, and she figured she was at least entitled to Hiccup's confidence. Had the dragon been mere feet behind him at the time? Was she, unknowingly, a step or two away from the most elusive of dragons? She'd never know. She'd probably never see Hiccup again. They were due to stay at least 2 more days before heading home to sit out the winter, and to Kamikaze, time couldn't move slower. If she wasn't hiding out on one of her ships, practicing her swordsmanship, she was with the other kids her age, and none of them were helpful in figuring out the reasoning behind Hiccup's actions. The main problem was that no one really knew Hiccup, not even his own father, so no one saw it coming. Snotlout clearly didn't have a close relationship with his cousin, and Hiccup's only childhood friend, Fishlegs, had drifted away when it became apparent he'd have to choose between Hiccup and the in crowd. The twins mostly viewed Hiccup as good victim material, targeting him in a number of their pranks as children, but warmed to him at his sheer daring as of late. They would, at times, act as though they were envious of Hiccup. Kamikaze found she could relate to them the easiest. On the other hand, that Astrid girl was rather terse and didn't hold back her concrete dislike of Hiccup. Such as in the current moment, as Kamikaze and Fishlegs began conversing on the tactical advantage of using a dragon in battle.
"They can move much faster than Vikings," Fishlegs said. "A Gronkle may have speed 4, but something like a Night Fury would have to be at least 18, maybe more."
Kamikaze's mind focused more on the actual battling aspects.
"Ooh, what if the dragon shot something with fire, and then you'd follow up by stabbing it? It's like insurance to make sure your victim's dead. I never stabbed something that's already burning before." "A dragon only belongs on the side of a Viking's blade," Astrid said when she couldn't hold her tongue anymore. She sounded rather assured, and no one had to ask which side of the blade she referred to. "Well, no one's ever tried the other side. Besides Hiccup, that is..."
Hiccup faltered at the scathing look Astrid sent his way.
I mean, there are bonuses to consider. An aerial attack could give the element of surprise." "Against who?" Astrid cut in.
Knowing she had everyone's attention, she met the eye of every teen present.
"Against us."
"Hiccup will be back," Kamikaze said flippantly. She picked at some dirt under her fingernail with one of her smaller daggers.
"You can ask him then what side he's on."
"I hope he lets us ride the dragon," Toughnut said brightly. His sister's smirk widened into an eager grin. Astrid looked at the pair in disgust. She felt like she spoke only to herself at times.
"If he comes back, we kill him. It's what we do to outlaws,"
she stated, flipping her new axe over her shoulder. It teetered a bit, not as balanced or practiced as her old axe, but she would get used to it in time. For a moment, No one said anything. Up until now, it had been deriding Hiccup's failure to embrace the Viking way and scoffing at his floundering attempts to fit in only to turn tail and join the dragons. But no one spoke of what would be done to him should he show his face again in the next 3 years. No one expected him to return. Everyone assumed the memory of Stoic the Vast's failure of his son would fade with the passing seasons. That, in the end, he would only amount to a black mark on Berg's otherwise outstanding history. Yeah, Snotlout said, sounding more unnerved than certain. He practically had the chieftainship in the bag, and while the slim chance Hiccup would return and try to reclaim his title existed, Snotlout had no burning desire to see Hiccup destroyed. Not like Astrid did. He couldn't understand Astrid's continuous hatred of his ex-cousin, even weeks after the departure. Sometimes he took advantage of her aggressive attitude to give them a common ground against weaklings. Other times, such as now, her intensity frightened him.
"No one's going to kill Hiccup,"
Kamikaze said, with an inexplicable need to defend a man who couldn't defend himself.
"Right, Fishy?"
Fishlegs looked pained. Deep down he wanted to agree. He knew if faced with the challenge he would not be able to take Hiccup's life. And yet he couldn't bring himself to disagree with his friends. His acceptance in their group was based on his blessed size and his willingness to do as told. He kept his eyes to his duck-footed stance and said nothing.
"Not before I get a ride, anyway,"
Ruffnut declared under her breath. It was loud enough for Astrid to catch. The unbending girl sent Ruffnut a severe glower before focusing on Kamikaze. Up until now, Kamikaze felt she managed to stay neutral with regard to how the other kids viewed her. She knew she just earned a spot in Astrid's bad book.
"Look, Pipsqueak,"
Astrid began, sounding for all in the world like she was trying to mimic a war general.
"Whatever betrothal arrangements your parents may have made with the chief are cancelled. Standing up for Hiccup isn't going to get you into any sort of position here, so you need to quit while you're ahead. He made his choice, and you do well not to defend him, especially around here."
Oh, no, she didn't. Toughnut guffawed loudly, slapping an oohing Snotlout on the shoulder.
"Can you imagine the kids?"
Toughnut crowed.
"They'd be midgets."
The broadside of his sword knocked him clean off his feet and onto the hardened dirt. Toughnut immediately flailed on his back, rolling back and forth, clutching his face and moaning of his pain. Kamikaze kept her grip on the handle of her weapon as she stormed up to Astrid.
"Let's get one thing straight, you butch sheep-brained shrew,"
Fishlegs gasped, Ruffnut looked elated, and Snotlout's jaw dropped. Kamikaze only came up to the other girl's nose, but she felt such indignation in that moment that she hardly cared.
"I am not, nor have I ever been, engaged to Hiccup. I'm not a social climber, and, unlike some people, I don't need to be. I was born into privilege. I am superior to you in status and in skill, and if I say Hiccup isn't going to be killed by the likes of you, then he won't."
Toughnut sat up, a huge red welt visible on his left cheek, and all of his attention on conflict before him. Astrid had never been talked down to before by someone of her age, and certainly not by someone smaller than her. The little outsider stared back, defiance bright in her eyes. Kamikaze thoroughly believed the words she spoke, and Astrid felt another shift in her universe. The same feeling she got when Hiccup began besting her in dragon training. This wasn't right. This wasn't to her plan, and this wasn't to be stood for.
"You and me, in the arena, now."
Kamikaze bared her teeth.
"Gladly."
Stoic nursed his tankard of meat. It might have been his 5th or 6th of the night, he hadn't been keeping track. The hour was late. Most of the village was asleep in the meat hall. Normally Stoic would be in the meat hall with the rowdiest of their guests, but after nearly a week of playing host, keeping up his strong facade, he needed a moment to himself. He sat on a rock ledge constructed next to his house and overlooked the village, taking in everything from Gobber's hillside shop down to the Thatcher's coastal lean-to. He could even count the tiny, bobbing lights of the bog burglars' ship windows had he wanted. Their guests would be leaving tomorrow. They would have stayed longer, but after the fight broke out, both Stoic and Bertha decided the recent, or not-so-recent scandal with the chief's son left too negative of an atmosphere. The fight. That had come as a shock to everybody. The girls were separated before any clear winner could be determined, but each gave the other a sound beating. Kamikaze, Stoic knew to taunt and tease as she fought, but to see the normally composed Hofferson lass spitting out her own set of insults threw many for a loop. Stoic almost lost a good chunk of his beard when he tried to pull her back. He gave the pair stern berating about inter-village relations and tolerance of different cultures, but left the actual disciplining to the parents. And the subject of the fight, Hiccup, had struck him harder than he expected. The boy caused trouble even in absence. Stoic couldn't understand it. He and Valka were the cream of the crop. Any child of theirs was meant to be the perfect Viking, strong, powerful, capable, and elite. Instead, Valka was taken before they could have any other kids. Instead, their only child questioned tradition and seemed incapable of putting on weight. Instead, their only child chose their mortal enemy over his own people.
Nothing's turned out as it should,
he muttered, staring beyond the rim of his murky reflection, concentric ripples distorting the face that stared gloomily back at him.
According to whom?
Stoic jolted at the voice by his elbow. Somehow, the village elder managed to sneak up on him, creaky bones and all. The small woman seated herself next to the mammoth of a man without prompt. Stoic stared at her as she did. The woman rarely spoke, and when she did, it was calculated. Only to one person at a time and in moments of privacy. A piece of his despair ebbed.
"You seem to be in the right state these days,"
she commented, her eyes on the sky rather than the village. He wasn't surprised she could see past his closed-off visage. She hadn't become the elder through age alone.
Well, what do you expect? After everything that's happened, everything's it's all so messed up.
He shifted his helmet to tuck back flyaway red hairs before replacing it atop his head.
"I'd expect you to remember the warnings laid clear in your past,"
the elder replied. Stoic snorted.
What I remember is marrying the most beautiful, talented Viking woman in the world. I remember taking over the chieftain duties with pride. I did everything right, like I was supposed to. I had everything.
He swept a hand across the view of the village.
The best possible life laying out before me, and then one by one everything just fell apart. Valka, now Hiccup.
He could feel the elder observe him with a shrewd stare, but Stoic kept his own to the village, trying desperately to find some good out there. Anything that could pull him off this destructive pattern of thinking.
"Do you remember what I told you when Hiccup was born?"
the elder asked. Stoic blinked at her with slightly bloodshot eyes.
Yeah, I do,"
he said softly, thinking back to the words.
"You picked him up? He was so small and sickly, and said, 'This boy
is not a Viking,'"
the elder cut in.
"And I stand by what I said."
Stoic stared, unseeing, at the teetering docks. The night was so clear, so calm, that the old creaking boards could be heard from their seats. He did remember. Oh, how he remembered. It was the first time he felt such rage towards the elder, when she held the product of his and Valka's union and uttered such an outrageous prediction.
"How did you know?"
he asked, his voice gone hoarse.
"How did you know, even then, that he would—"
He paused and took a breath.
"I tried to make a Viking out of him. I tried to encourage the right sort of things and put a stop to his constant questioning and the whimsical fantasizing."
The elder shook her head.
"The gods had other plans for him. Your efforts were always futile."
"Plans?" Stoic scoffed. "The gods have no need for someone like him."
A thin, white eyebrow cocked in his direction.
"Do you really think so?"
Wrinkled lips stretched into a smile.
"I, Stoic Warmonger Haddock, am the medium here, not you. You are the man who needs to have a little more faith in everything."
She tipped back her tankard and took a healthy gulp of the liquid within. Stoic only then noticed the elder had brought her own supply of mead. The woman straightened out and smacked her lips.
"I know that look. You don't want to challenge me to a drinking contest, young man. I've got a good many years over you of tolerance conditioning."
For the first time in months, Stoic laughed.